You live surrounded by noise, not only from the world, but from thought itself. Even in quiet rooms, the mind continues speaking. You call this activity intelligence, yet it rarely brings peace. You try to pause, to think less. The effort becomes another form of thinking. The mind that seeks silence becomes its own disturbance. Al-Ghazali confronted this paradox nearly 1,000 years ago. He said that silence is not the end of thought, but the purification of it. The mind does not find peace by refusing to think, but by cleansing what it thinks from self-claim. True silence, he taught, is not muteness. It is the still order of thought that no longer serves the ego. If every effort to quiet the mind deepens its noise, what kind of silence remains possible? In the 11th century, Al-Ghazali reached the highest seat of learning in Baghdad. He mastered philosophy, law, and theology. His arguments silenced opponents, yet could not silence himself. Knowledge gave him power, but not certainty. He began to see that intellect alone cannot reach what it seeks, because reason, while noble, feeds on its own movement. It cannot stop without losing itself. So he left his position, his students, his fame. He withdrew, not in despair, but to search for a silence deeper than understanding, a silence where truth would no longer depend on words. You equate thinking with knowing. The more you analyze, the more secure you feel. Yet the mind often mistakes motion for clarity. It circles its own conclusions, decorating repetition with the illusion of progress. Al-Ghazali called this the veil of intellect, thought trying to purify itself by multiplying itself. The more you reason, the more subtle your doubts become. You begin to suspect that reasoning cannot lead beyond reasoning. The problem is not thought itself, but identification with it. When you believe the voice in your mind is who you are, silence feels like death. But if thought is merely one appearance within awareness, then who is the one aware of thinking? And can that awareness ever be restless? You try to manage the mind by discipline, to stop, to redirect, to refine. Yet the very act of control begins with an I that wants mastery. Al-Ghazali warned that this I is the impurity that silence must cleanse. When you try to force stillness, you confirm the existence of the one who disturbs it. Control belongs to the same restlessness it seeks to end. He taught that silence cannot be achieved by effort. It appears when effort becomes transparent. The self that claims authorship over thought must be seen for what it is, a habit of ownership. If silence is not achieved through control, perhaps it begins when the controller is no longer believed in. Listen closely to your own thinking. It argues, anticipates, remembers, imitates. You call it my thought, but Al-Ghazali questioned this ownership. He said most of what the mind repeats is borrowed, fragments of culture, memory, and desire. The mind becomes a market of voices, each claiming truth. To cleanse the mind is to see this borrowing. Silence, then, is not emptiness but originality, the point where thought arises from direct awareness, not imitation. You begin to see how much of your thinking belongs to others, how much of your certainty was inherited rather than realized. If these thoughts are echoes, who speaks when they stop? What remains when the inner noise is no longer mistaken for self? For Al-Ghazali, silence was not merely intellectual, it was ethical. He linked mental noise to the impurity of intention. The tongue becomes restless when the heart seeks approval. Even inner dialogue is a subtle performance, rehearsed before imagined audiences. You realize that thinking often hides the will to be right. The mind argues not for truth, but for identity. To cleanse the mind, therefore, is to cleanse motive. You stop thinking to win and start thinking to see dot when thought is no longer bent towards self-approval. Silence begins to appear naturally. If intention is purified, does speech lose its vanity? And can thought itself become an act of sincerity? Al-Ghazali's crisis of doubt was not a fall from faith, but a passage through it. He realized that certainty built on assumption is fragile, while true conviction arises only after thought admits its limits. Doubt, for him, was the mind's first silence, the moment when words no longer suffice. It humbles intellect, washing away arrogance. You begin to see that silence does not oppose knowledge. It refines it. When the mind accepts what it cannot command, it becomes clear. This is not ignorance, but purification, a stillness that listens rather than insists. If doubt cleanses belief, what kind of faith remains once thought no longer needs to defend it? As the chatter softens, awareness remains. You begin to see that silence is not something you create. It was always present beneath the noise. Al-Ghazali called this the awakening of the heart. Here, knowledge ceases to be collected and becomes direct seeing. The mind still moves, but awareness no longer follows it. You do not think about silence. You recognize it. This recognition is not an experience, but a shift from being the thinker to being the one who witnesses thinking. In that witnessing, thought loses its authority, but not its usefulness. It becomes transparent, light, and functional. If this awareness observes even the mind, then where does true knowing reside? In thought, or in the seeing that holds it? Thought does not disappear forever. It returns practical, structured, alive. But it no longer dominates thought. Al-Ghazali said that the purified mind still thinks, but now from silence, not from self. Thought becomes an instrument rather than identity. You begin to notice that clarity is not the absence of movement, but the absence of distortion. Silence is no longer a gap between thoughts. It is the background that allows them to appear and fade without conflict. When the mind rises from this ground, speech regains meaning. If silence can host thought without losing itself, has peace ever been separate from motion or only hidden beneath misunderstanding? You began by trying to silence the mind through effort. You end by realizing that silence was never absent, only unnoticed. Al-Ghazali's hidden practice reveals that the mind does not need destruction, but cleansing. It is not the enemy of silence, but its instrument when purified. True stillness is not against thought. It is the ground from which clear thought arises. When ownership ends, thought becomes transparent. When intention is pure, speech becomes truth. When doubt is accepted, faith becomes real. You do not silence the mind. You return it to its natural order, a servant, not a ruler. This is the silence that cleanses the mind, not the end of thought, but the restoration of awareness to its rightful place. At first, you believe silence meant escape from thought. Now you see it means freedom within it. The noise was never in the world. It was in the claim of ownership, the belief that the thinker was separate from awareness. Al-Ghazali's teaching turns this belief inside out. Silence does not oppose thinking. It purifies the one who thinks. It is not muteness, but clarity. When the self no longer uses thought to confirm itself, silence remains even as words are spoken. And in that silence, knowledge becomes pure seeing, thought redeemed by the stillness that holds it.